The Bible is full of poetry, especially in the Old Testament. How do we identify poetry and how can we interpret that today using our English Bibles? Let's talk about that subject. Hello, welcome to Clarity and Brevity. Today I'm joined again by Dr. Jonny Gibson from Westminster Seminary, and we're going to talk about how we can read the Psalms in particular, which are full of poetry, but it's a different type of poetry than we may be used to. So, Jonny, tell me, what's the basic building block of the Psalms, or the basic building block of Hebrew poetry?
It's called the colon. It's the simple line of Hebrew poetry. In the Hebrew language, it's about 3 words. You can have less than 3 words, more than 3 words, but generally it's about 3 words. And that's the basic building block. Hebrew parallelism is what we've all heard of, I'm sure, of how Hebrew poetry works. And so it's a colon in parallel to another colon. So we'll call it colon A, your first line, colon B. And those 2 cola together are called a bicolon, 2 parallel lines of Hebrew together. And that's really the basic building block of Hebrew poetry, the bicolon. Makes up about 75% of Hebrew parallelism. You can get monocolon, monocola, plural. That's 1 line on its own. An example would be Jonah chapter 2, at the end of Jonah's poem, salvation belongs to the Lord. That's a monocolon. Or in Psalm 2, blessed are all those who take refuge in him. It's a climactic single line of poetry. That's called a monocolon. The other kinds are tricolon, 3 cola together, or a tetracolon, 4 cola together, or a pentacolon, 5 cola together. They make up about 25% of Hebrew poetry, but the bulk is made up of bicola, 2 lines of poetry, 1 colon in parallel to another colon.
So these cola, they don't rhyme, and that's the way we often think of poetry still today. So how do they relate to each other? What are the options?
Well, in Hebrew they rhyme, but in our English Bibles we obviously lose that as we get the translation. Though I suppose the closest thing we could look for in English is the Scottish Psalter, which tries to rhyme the Psalms, not from the Hebrew rhyme, but still tries to rhyme them. But our English Bibles, it loses all of the rhyme. But in the Hebrew, the rhyme is present. But how they relate to each other is really, in our English Bibles, we can see how they relate to each other in content, what we would call semantic parallelism. And there's 3 kinds of semantic parallelism. There's synonymous parallelism, where colon B, the second line of the parallelism, is synonymous to colon A. So it's all about how colon B relates to colon A. So the first kind of semantic parallelism is synonymous. The second is antithetic parallelism, where colon B says the opposite of colon A. And the third kind is what's called synthetic parallelism, where colon B develops the thought of colon A in some way. It can be complementary, it can be climactic, it can be specifying, intensifying, explanatory, give a purpose clause, it can give a circumstantial clause, things like that. Scholars talk about A, what's more B, where B develops the thought of A. So that's called synthetic parallelism. So when you're reading your English Bible, in the Psalms, for example, if you have those 3 categories in mind, synonymous parallelism, antithetic parallelism, and synthetic parallelism, you'll be able to spot those 3 kinds as you read, say, Psalm 1.
Well, what if there's more than 2 lines, or more than 2 cola? Where does the synthesis come into view? Is it the last line, or is it somewhere else?
It's a good question. So in a tricolon or a tetracolon, you just keep relating the next colon to the previous colon, right? So if we could look at Psalm 1, for example, blessed is the man, that's 1 colon, who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, second colon, nor stands in the way of sinners, third colon, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, fourth colon. So Psalm 1:1 is a tetracolon. The opening line, the first colon, is the main line, and everything else relates to it. Okay, so what we have here is not synonymous parallelism, not antithetical parallelism, but synthetic parallelism. Colon B, C, and D specify something about the man in A, but B, C, and D are not synonymous. B, C, and D, we would say, are synthetic sequential. You can see that in the verbs. Walks, stands, sits. There's a regression in his movement. So those three lines are sequential, but all three are specifying something about the blessed man. So that's an example of synthetic parallelism. Verse 2 is a nice example of synonymous parallelism, where you've got colon A and colon B. There's your bicolon. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, colon A, and on his law he meditates day and night, colon B. So there's a bicolon. And colon B is really just saying the same as colon A. His delight is in the law of the Lord. And how does he delight in it? He meditates on it day and night. So it's saying the same thing. He delights, he meditates. And in both cases, it's on the law of the Lord. So that would be more synonymous parallelism.
Could that one be synthetic as well, if it adds the day and the night aspect?
Again, these categories are not hermetically sealed, and they come down to the commentator or interpreter's, preference. I have parsed that as synonymous. Others may say, it's more synthetic because it's now specifying perhaps the intensity of his delight. It's day and night. So that's also a possibility. Perhaps a clearer synonymous parallelism would be verse 5. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. There's a really clear synonymous parallelism. Verse 6 is an example of antithetical parallelism in a bicolon. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, there's colon A, but the way of the wicked will perish, colon B. And colon B is in contrast to colon A. And you can see that with the contrast of the righteous and the wicked. And the way of the righteous, the way of the wicked. They're being set up as an antithesis. So that's an example of antithetical parallelism.
And in that case, the English translation includes but. Is that often the case for antithetical parallelism?
Not always. No, but it helps there. Yeah. It helps set it up there. Yeah.
Now, maybe you could say a word about how do those who read Hebrew know where these cola are. In our English Bible, is it simply, do we trust where the line breaks are or the semicolon? Maybe you could say a word about identifying them.
Yeah, generally speaking, the English Bible gets it about right, but not always. So, for example, in verse 3, he is like a tree that looks like one colon, right? Planted by streams of water. But in the Hebrew, he is like a tree planted by streams of colon is one colon. It's quite a long colon, okay? But now, how do we know that? Three things. As I said, you generally aim for 3 words, but it can be longer than that, as is the case here. It's 5 words in the Hebrew. Accents. On each Hebrew word there's an accent, and those accents are called conjunctive accents or disjunctive accents. And a disjunctive accent breaks the end of the colon or marks the end of the colon to indicate you begin the next colon. So when you've got access to the Hebrew, you can spot it quite clearly where the colon ends. It's a major disjunctive marker accent, would mark the end of the colon. And the third thing is the content, the syntax, what makes sense to end the colon at this point. So he is like a tree planted by streams of water, colon A, that or which yields its fruit in its season, and that or which its leaves do not wither. So those 2 lines are specifying something about the first line, the tree planted by the rivers of water. So those are your 3 things. The number of words in a colon. Again, you need the Hebrew to really decipher that. The accents, you need the Hebrew, and then the content. What's the logic and where does it make sense to end the colon.
Right. So this can sound maybe theoretical to some degree. Do you have any examples for how understanding the parallelism of the various types could help you interpret a passage, or how it guides the interpretation of a passage?
Well, it's back to that semantic parallelism where synonymous means the second line's just saying the same as the first. And what's the point in that? Well, that's poetry. Even in our English language, we do that with poetry. We repeat a first line and a second line, perhaps putting it differently, just to reinforce the point. Antithetical just means we're saying the opposite, and so we're trying to communicate two things. And Psalm 1 is trying to communicate two ways to live. Right? There's the way of the righteous, there's the way of the wicked, and the antithesis, the antithetical parallelism, really contributes to that. The Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. So which way are you going to live? And then the synthetic sort of really helps to carry the poem along. It's a bit like prose. It's in sentences. So blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. We're being led along by that synthetic parallelism. So that gives it more of the story, prose, narrative feel to it. For example, a book like Lamentations, which is really retelling the story of the destruction of Jerusalem and Judah, is written in 5 acrostic poems for the 5 chapters, and it's generally in synthetic parallelism, not synonymous and not antithetic. And it's because it's trying to also tell the story of what happened.
So in terms of practical tips, I can think of a couple. Tell me if you think these sound right, and maybe you could add some more. If we're reading Hebrew poetry in our English Bibles, one thing we can do is pay attention that it is poetry, and you can often see that by the way it's set off in poetry. Another thing is to try to identify where the breaks are, that they put, like this, the commas or the semicolons or the periods, to help identify those cola. Maybe another idea is if you're reading the Bible on an electronic version, to make sure you have the Hebrew poetry option selected, if it gives you that option, so that it doesn't flatten out all of the words and just put them on the screen. Any other ideas or suggestions for those who are coming to this to an English Bible?
I think your suggestions are helpful. The punctuation in the English generally follows it, and even the way it's set out, as you said, it's not just a paragraph of text like it is in prose. But I think just keeping those 3 categories in mind: synonymous, antithetical, synthetic. As I say, because of the Hebrew being translated into English, we lose the end rhyme, we lose some of the poetic features that is going on there, but the parallelism is really where the exegetical content is.
And maybe just one final question. Maybe make it a brief comment or so. Why is it good that we have poetry in the Bible? Not just historical narratives, not just letters, but what is it about poetry that's particularly meaningful in terms of the different topographies of Scripture that we have?
Well, if you think about a sermon, what makes a sermon listenable? What makes it intelligible and easy to listen to? It's when the pastor uses illustrations, when they lighten it up with an application with everyday life. And poetry sort of does that. It's full of metaphors. It's full of similes that are in our world. So we can immediately identify with something. This man, the blessed man, will be like a tree planted by a river. Well, we all know what trees planted by rivers look like. They're always fruitful. They're always got their leaves on. And so we can immediately identify with it. So I think what poetry does is it uses language like metaphors and similes and figures of speech to give us windows into what it is God's trying to communicate to us. And it makes it more interesting. The second thing is, it, I think, often communicates the emotion that's behind the author and the content. Poetry is very emotional in its structure, in its content, in its rhyme. And I think that the affections, the emotions of the poet can come across better in that particular style of writing than if he just wrote it in prose.
Very good. Well, that's helpful. Thank you, Johnny. Thanks for watching. I hope this has been helpful for you. Remember to keep it clear and focus on Christ.